Dr. Evan Miyakawa. He breaks down trends, stats, analytics, and so much more. And we wanted to have him on today to discuss many things that he sees as the tournament, the field is set. And we hear a lot, Evan, about, and thanks for your time today, we hear a lot about this region's easier than that one, or this one's more difficult. And I don't know if none of them are easy. But in a way, can you see, based on what you have statistically, of what region might be the most difficult and the other one that may be the not easiest path, but smoothest path?
Yeah, I think these regions are pretty even this year compared to previous years. I do think that a lot of times the number one overall seed gets a pretty easy path to the Final Four. I do not think that's the case this year for Gonzaga, especially with a potential Elite Eight rematch against either Texas Tech or Duke. Both those teams are really tough. So I think that's they didn't get off light there, which I think is somewhat unusual. I do think the toughest path is probably in the East region for Baylor. And part of that is because there's a matchup looming against North Carolina potentially in the second round. North Carolina is a top 20 team according to my metrics. And then St. Mary's is a team that all season long has stuck out to me, especially recently, as being a potential, seed a team that could make a deep run without having a high seed. And then you're looking at a matchup against maybe Kentucky or Purdue in the Elite Eight. So I do think that Baylor has probably the hardest region. I think Kansas probably has the easiest one. Right now I have them at about 40% chance of making the Final Four. Iowa could be a challenge in the Sweet 16, but then when you're looking at an Elite Eight matchup against either Auburn, Wisconsin, or maybe a team like LSU, none of those teams particularly scare me, so I think Kansas probably has the easiest path.
In Baylor's region, I mean, obviously the 2 seed is Kentucky, and that's going to be tough. Oscar Tshiebwe is probably the player of the year nationally, but that's going to be tough for anybody, and they're not going to see them until the Elite Eight. But when you look at UCLA potentially in the Sweet 16, you mentioned St. Mary's, all of that. Are those good matchups player for Baylor lineup-wise?
I think Baylor's biggest weakness is going to be their rotation depth, especially if LJ Cryer isn't available once you get to that second weekend. If they're only playing 7 guys, I do think that's going to hurt against teams that have more depth. So I think that's the main thing to look out for is, I think St. Mary's and UCLA probably have a little bit more to throw at them in terms of rotation depth. If LJ Cryer is more healthy, I think that's a huge difference for Baylor in terms of their ceiling as far as how far they could go.
What did you think about Texas A&M being left out of the tournament?
I think it was a snub. Almost every bracketologist, including myself, had them in the field based on their body of work. And I really think that the selection committee did not consider at all the results of Saturday or Sunday's games in terms of crediting teams who did good work. So I think they should have been in the field.
Yeah, and they did lose 8 in a row, right? That's something you just can't overlook. And the only way they could have got in, I guess, based on what we've seen, was if they would have won yesterday. And was it Richmond who beat Davidson, or vice versa? That was one of the open spots as well, right?
Yes, Richmond got in and beat Davidson in the Atlantic 10 tournament championship yesterday, and so that definitely stole a spot. But as we saw, Texas A&M wasn't even the first team left out of the field. There were a couple teams ahead of them. So yeah, I think to me, really, you could have picked this bracket after Friday's games, and it wouldn't have changed at all after Saturday and Sunday based on the way that the selection committee put teams in the field and how they seeded them.
By the way, look at that fancy little setup he's got.
I know,
now.
Yeah. That's what happens when you get that PhD.
You
get those 3 letters.
I like
That's
it. Looks
what
great.
happens.
Evan looks great.
Evan, what team do you think yesterday, when their name popped up on the screen, went from yay to crap?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm looking through the bracket right now. I think Houston and Illinois in the South region as the 4 and 5. I felt like both of those teams had potential to go far, but now they're going to have to face each other potentially in the second round if they get past their first round matchups. And then Arizona at a 1 seed there is also probably one of the best teams in the field. So I think both those teams had potential to go far, but getting matched up against each other is kind of a tough draw there.
Evan, I know a lot of Tennessee fans in particular very upset about their seeding in comparison with Duke. A lot of people thinking there's a little bit of a Coach K bump there. How did you see that, from your point of view?
The crazy thing to me is Tennessee was in the conversation as potentially getting Baylor's #1 seed. So the fact that they didn't even get on the 2 line is pretty wild. And I think the committee hasn't really said anything that's been convincing in terms of why they put Duke on the 2 line. Other bracketologists have tried to explain it and can't. So I'm pretty flabbergasted by that, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, now, you mentioned St. Mary's, and they're a 5 seed. Is there anyone outside of that 5? I brought up the stats. 1, 2s, and 3 seeds win this thing almost year in and year out, and have now for decades. Is there anyone you would consider to be this is the team we're talking about? They could get to the Sweet 16 and perhaps even deeper as far as Cinderella.
In terms of Cinderella, if I'm looking at double-digit seeds, I think Michigan is a team that has potential. They've obviously had their ups and downs, but a huge trend that often plays out in the tournament is that teams that were preseason AP top 25 teams with high expectations that underperformed during the year often revert back to preseason form. Michigan was by far, by many accounts, a top 10 team in the preseason. They have all of that talent. So as an 11 seed, I see them as being dangerous and definitely being underseeded there in terms of what I expect from them. Another potential Cinderella team would be a team like South Dakota State on the 13 line. They're a very, very strong team. And so I also think that they have the ability to beat a Providence team that a lot of people are calling lucky because of how many close wins they've had. So they're also a team to me that sticks out.
What do you think about LSU having to go into this thing with an interim coach?
That definitely is an interesting wrinkle. I kind of feel like the hype of the tournament might not affect them as much as, say, if they were in the regular season. And I actually see LSU as being a team that, despite a rocky finish to the season, they actually have the highest odds of any team outside the top 5 seeds of getting to the Final Four, according to my bracket simulations. So I see them as being an undervalue or a value pick at the 6 line. But I do think that coaching aspect will certainly play a part in some way.
Evan, Big 12 with a solid number of teams. The Big 10 getting 9 teams. What did you think of that?
I think it's deserved overall. I mean, I think you could certainly make a case that 1 or 2 could have gotten in, 1 or 2 could have gotten out. I think the Big 10 just benefits from the fact that they have so many teams. And I think we've seen from the Big 10 all year long, no great teams in that conference, but a lot of good ones.
So, you mentioned Baylor's draw, and it's obviously a bunch of blue bloods, but we look at the name that are blue bloods. That doesn't mean there'll always be blue bloods. North Carolina will be a blue blood, but these are blue bloods that have done well this year. North Carolina just beat Duke, as we know, about a week or 2 ago. Among the teams you mentioned, Kentucky's the #2 seed. Are they better, as in your opinion, based on what you've seen, than Purdue or UCLA?
I do think right now, I would say Kentucky probably has the strongest team in that region. I would take them over Baylor right now, just purely in terms of what they bring on the court, especially with Baylor's injuries that they're dealing with. Purdue has always been an interesting one. Their offense is incredible. Their defense is lacking. So it's hard to say who's going to come out of that. But if you're looking at either Kentucky, Purdue out of the bottom of that East region, I think that's a really, really strong team and probably has a good chance of going to the Final Four. I do think Baylor, the matchups that they have are against teams that are probably all slightly underseeded in terms of how they're predicted to do compared to their seed. I think North Carolina is better than an 8 seed. I think St. Mary's is better than a 5. Kentucky, in terms of strength, should be a 1 seed. So it's definitely a tough path there.
You mentioned something about Gonzaga and their path earlier, Evan, and stylistically to me, I know this isn't numbers, this is just me from watching these teams. If I'm Gonzaga, I'm a little concerned that, Arkansas, Texas Tech, and Duke all could be, in Alabama maybe potentially with their 4 guards could all be in my way. Given the way that Gonzaga loses, those are kind of bad matchups for them.
Yeah, Arkansas and Alabama stick out to me both as being teams that are kind of high ceiling, low floor teams. So I think they're both could be, easily upset. But if they make it far enough to play Gonzaga, I do think that they definitely have the ability to turn it up and play good against good teams. We've already seen Gonzaga lose to Alabama and Duke in that region, and they played Texas Tech in a close game earlier this season as well. I think that the rematch potential for any of those against Alabama or Texas Tech or Duke doesn't play in Gonzaga's favor. I think when you see rematches, oftentimes they're a little bit closer and there's less differential between those teams when they play each other again.
With the Big 12, you've kind of laid out Baylor's path, and I know Kansas has a pretty nice draw based on what most people have said, but was there any draw that you saw for one of these Big 12 teams where either in a good or bad way you're like, oof, like either that's going to be that's a tough one right there, or that's one that's going to be pretty favorable for them outside of Kansas and Baylor?
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting is a team like Iowa State. They started out the year really, really hot. They've struggled in Big 12 play. But if you're looking at their region, I think, LSU is going to be a tough first-round matchup. But if they get past that, they're looking at, say, a 3 seed in Wisconsin or a 2 seed in Auburn. And both of those teams, to me, at least according to my predictive metrics, are weaker according to their seed line. So I think Iowa State has a chance to actually kind of turn the direction on their season, so to speak, and potentially make a deep run. I'm not saying that's likely to happen, but I do think that they could have had a worse matchup there.
You have the latest, one of your latest tweets is which teams rely heavily on their most used player? And a couple of teams that maybe people don't know much about. Wyoming's one of them. Is that correct? We know about Johnny Davis at Wisconsin. In fact, might end up being player of the year. But there's a couple of teams in here of the mid-majors, is that right, that are the ones that are relied on the most?
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting trend to look at, especially for teams that are going to be underdogs in a lot of their games. Which teams rely heavily on one player? I think those teams have a lot of upset potential. You look at historical performances like Steph Curry for Davidson, for example. If you have a star guy that you can rely on and they play well, you might have the ability to knock off some of these more elite teams. So I look at a team like Wyoming with their star Hunter Maldonado. He has one of the highest usage rates in the country. Peter Kiss for Bryant is not likely to beat a 1 seed if they were to advance out of their playing game, but that's another one. So that's definitely an interesting trend to watch. I do think when you're looking at national championship caliber teams, relying on one player too much can be a little bit of a detriment in terms of having consistency in those 6 games down the stretch. Baylor's team last year was pretty middle of the pack in, relying on one guy versus balanced output. And I think it's very similar for the Baylor team this year.
Yeah, as much as Butler or Davion or Maceo or could take over a game, they were all like a 3- and 4-headed animal, monster, because and also with Vital as well. So, yeah, and I guess of all the elite high-ranked seeds, Wisconsin's a 3 seed, they have Davis. The next closest that has somebody that's relied on the most is Obaji. Is that right at Kansas? Is he right there along with Banchero at Duke?
Yeah, Abaji is definitely a relied upon guy at Kansas, but not quite in the way that Johnny Davis is at Wisconsin.
Right.
I mean, Wisconsin just leans on him really heavily, and he'll probably win or lose them a game down the stretch if it's close.
Anything else? Evan?
You filled out your bracket, Evan?
I'm actually waiting a day to kind of let it all sink in, and gonna wait to fill out my official one tomorrow.
Do you stick all these things you have your own special computer and then you put all of them in there and it spits it out for you, or is there going to be some opinion and bias on your way, or is this going to be all analytical the way you pick it?
Oh, there's definitely got to be some touch and feel to it. It's not fun if you don't. Now, with that being said, I do think I start to lean more towards finding teams that are good value picks as opposed to teams that I think are going to go the farthest, because last year's a great example. Gonzaga was the most likely team heading into the tournament to win the national title. And yet, if you picked Gonzaga in your pool and they won the title, you still weren't likely to win because so many other people picked them. That's why Baylor was a great pick as a national title in brackets last year, because of the value that they brought. So I think taking a similar approach this year, where you're not just looking at the teams you think will advance, but teams that you think will have a better chance of advancing than other people are putting in their brackets, that's really where the value is.
And one of the other things that he has, evanmaya.com, is you do 1,000 tournament simulations, and then you take whoever is the top, right? And Gonzaga, that's what you did. Arizona, Kansas, Duke, Baylor's number 6 or 7? So of the top seeds, they're the ones furthest down the list on that.
Yeah, in terms of looking at, based on these simulations that I run, how likely each team is to advance to each round, Baylor definitely has the lowest chance of any of the 1 seeds of winning the national championship, but they're still definitely in the top, 8 or 10 teams there. Thank
you, Evan. Appreciate your time, as always. Man, he's getting a lot of national attention. People are starting to understand what he's been doing. Came on with us last year. and really enjoy the analytical part of it, which is something a lot of things are happening that way when it comes to sports more than ever before on just rather feel or even gut feeling. When we come back, a couple other notes about the tournament itself at 4 o'clock.